welcome everyone to SFOX's interview with Charlie Shrem. We're so excited to have you, Charlie. For those of you who don't know Charlie, you must not have been in the crypto space for very long, but Charlie has, among some of his many titles and accolades. Charlie was the founder and CEO of BitInstant. He was the founder and vice chairman of the Bitcoin Foundation. He's currently the founder and the podcaster for Untold Stories and the founder of Crypto IQ. And knowing you, Charlie, I'm sure you have many other projects in the works that maybe you can enlighten me about later on.
Yeah, absolutely.
But again, thank you just so much for being here. We're excited to chat with you today, Charlie.
I'm happy to be here.
So I figured we would start with kind of the beginnings of crypto and your experience in it, considering that you were one of its first users back when crypto was just Bitcoin. I'd love to hear the story of how you first came across it, what drew you into it, and what inspired you to start investing in it.
It's a good question. You know, it was a very different world back then. There was no crypto. It was just Bitcoin. There wasn't, community. There wasn't like even people like weren't really theorizing about like the future because it was let's focus on the now and let's just kind of play around. It was more of like just this big social experiment. And I found out about it on a chat room amongst almost everyone back in those days found out about Bitcoin and like on a chat room or whatever. And that led us to another chat room. And that other chat room was pretty much the whole Bitcoin community back then. And so that's kind of where I found out about it. And that's what where I hung out. My first foray, I was still in college, but my first foray into Bitcoin was I was selling like airline vouchers on the Bitcoin forum for Bitcoin. So that was like my hustle. Back then, kind of everyone had a hustle. Like you're contributing to the community. You're contributing to this like small economy. You have buyers and sellers, and the medium of exchange was Bitcoin. And so that's kind of what it was, and it was awesome.
So as you just said, you started getting into Bitcoin when you were still in college, right? Which is kind of an unusual thing. I mean, when I was in my senior year of college, I was doing things like working on a thesis and thinking about what's my postgraduate job going to be.
Yeah.
And you were, like you just said, right, hustling and building, your stake in the Bitcoin community. So what were you thinking? What inspired you to do that?
I was in school and I had a startup that I was doing electronics. It was pretty boring, but I was just doing it to earn a paycheck to basically pay my way through school. And you're right. Like I frequently thought about like what's going to be my career. Even like I didn't even know what my career was going to be. I majored in economics, but how do you work in as an economist? I'm not going to work for the Federal Reserve, right? So I don't want to sit in a research facility all day doing math. I didn't want to do any of that. And I love business. I've always been a businessman since I was a kid. So I was trying to figure out like what would be my thing. I very quickly realized that I'm like psychologically unemployable, and so I very quickly realized that whatever I do, I'm going to have to do on my own. And so that's why I started that first startup when I was in school. And then, eventually I got into Bitcoin when I was about to graduate. So I really didn't have to worry about what my career was going to be.
That's a good kind of life hack, I guess, if you think that you're
Yeah.
psychologically unemployable, which is an interesting term. Um, on that note, maybe you could tell us a little bit about BitInstant, right? Because you started it again, like from your college dorm, as I understand it. You went through the whole process of raising money, and it became like not just one of the first U.S. exchanges, but one of the most popular ones too. So, what was that like to go from thinking about what your career was going to be to suddenly being thrown into the world of managing a Bitcoin exchange?
So I didn't know anything about compliance. I didn't even know what the word compliance like was. So that was like being thrown into that whole world of like, so I'm like literally sitting in, I remember even the scene. I was like sitting in my cousin's like living room, on my laptop, and he's just like making some barbecue or whatever. And I'm like 20 years old and I'm like registering for FinCEN. And I'm like barely reading the questions, like, are you the compliance? Who's the compliance officer? Well, like, I'm the only employee. So Charlie Shrem, chief compliance officer. And I'm like, will you file suspicious activity reports? Yes. Like, I didn't know what I was doing. They probably should not let random people just register for FinCEN as a money service business. But that's what it was back then,
Yeah, that's amazing. I can't even imagine. I mean, and that seems like a relatively simple example of, I'm sure, all of the new terrain that you had to navigate as one of the first people in Bitcoin that just had not been forged before. But let's talk about that for a second, right? Because you started out as one of the first people paving the way in Bitcoin. And now, as we enter this second decade of crypto, so to speak, it's not just Bitcoin, it's a ton of different coins. There are tons of different businesses. So given kind of the breadth and length of your experience in the sector, I'm just curious, what are some of the like most significant ways that you've seen it change that have defined how the sector has evolved over the
Yeah,
last?
it's a good question, and there's a lot of different like answers to that based on what we're talking about. So like for example, like community, the community is you can almost like chart the community that has changed. Obviously, the price has changed. Um, so there's a lot of those factors that have changed. But then like just the overall like the lingo and the terms, you can chart that. Like it went from Bitcoin to Ethereum. Well, I went from Bitcoin and then there was altcoins. This was before Ethereum. So altcoin was alternative to Bitcoin. So it wasn't a negative term. We should actually try to reclaim that term because it's not a negative term. And so there was, a lot of like copywriters for a lot of copy editors for new crypto companies don't like to use the word altcoin because it thinks it's a negative connotation, but it's not. And it was never meant to be. It's actually an extremely accurate term. Um, and so now what I do on Twitter and stuff is I separate Bitcoin and crypto for me are two separate things. There's Bitcoin and there's that kind of industry, and then there's things that work in and around Bitcoin. Then there's kind of crypto and everything else. No other community has reached the level of Bitcoin at this point. Even the Ethereum community is significantly dwarfed the Bitcoin community. But I think that if there was a community that would be the next that I could call it on its own, I would say like, yeah, Ethereum, Litecoin, and a lot of the other, like you have like bigger communities like with Tezos and Hedera Hashgraph, and you have a lot of these communities now that are growing. It's nice to see those, it's nice to see these individual non-hostile communities because you have like Ripple community is so hostile. The Dash community used to be hostile, but I like the Dash community now. They got, really, they're just a really nice community and they realize what their goals are and they're off doing their own thing. And so I'm bullish on that. And so, yeah.
So Charlie, one of the things that you just alluded to in your answer that really interests me as I look out in the crypto and Bitcoin verse is just the level of hostility that is not
Yeah.
always out there, as you point out, but can oftentimes be out there, right? And a lot of these communities, it seems like, will just dismiss other people who think differently than they do or support different coins than they do as just shilling or not knowing what they're talking about or X, Y, and Z, right? So given how long you've been in the space and the number of communities that you've either been directly involved in or have experience in, do you just have any recommendations or insights as to how people who are involved in the crypto world can avoid that kind of negativity and hostility and build the overall sector in a positive way?
It's a very good question. Um, I see a lot of people like get discouraged. I've had, a lot of friends even that um, were in this space early on are not, they're not involved anymore because, like you said, it's just, you get jaded, right? You lose sight, you get jaded. And it's a real fear. And so it's saddened when I see that. But at the same time, you see so many more people joining. Now, the hostility in the Civil War and the tribalism, it really is such a small, like, minority. I almost like separate my Twitter now as like I'm gonna create a list of all those like vocal tribal minority people and just turn them on and off whenever I feel like, because at the same time you don't want to live in like an echo chamber. You don't want to live in a bubble. So you should always like kind of know what's going on at the same time. You know what I mean? But don't like, if it gets too much, don't lose sight of what's really important.
Right. No, that's good advice because an echo chamber can definitely be dangerous, but also if you're just always being bombarded by the negativity, it can be so demoralizing, especially when
Oh
you're
my God, yeah.
right. I'm sure you know that better than I do.
Mhm.
Let me ask you. So given that some communities that are alternatives to Bitcoin can definitely be positive entities, as you said, in your personal view, as you look to the future of what's been built so far, Do you think that different blockchains and cryptocurrencies can coexist peacefully, or do you think that
1000%. And anyone who says that they can't, or in my opinion, is wrong. Everything can you know, but it depends. Like, so you look at like something like um, openly, you know, some coins that are openly hostile to Bitcoin. You know, you look at Bitcoin SV. Um, that's one that's like, to me, it's openly hostile to Bitcoin. So it's like, then something like that, there's no reason for that, you know?
sure, but you think that, absent open hostility, there's a way for altcoins and Bitcoins to coexist in the future?
Yeah, yeah, 100%.
Got it. Uh, Thinking out more generally to your experience in crypto and Bitcoin, which three people would you say have been the most influential to you personally, and why?
Oh, that it really depends on when. And I don't like this question because whenever I name people or companies, other people come back to me and say, "Why didn't you name me?" Um, but I love people that are not just talking heads. I love people that are builders. I love people that work and say, I want to build, I want to do things. You know, builders, builders, builders. Those are the best. You have a lot of people that are just like talking heads. You know, I do a podcast, but I also built a lot and I build now. You look at Anthony Pompliano, he built a lot of things. He's investing, he's building, he runs a great podcast. Um, a lot of the other podcasts, in fact, all the other podcasts that I in the crypto space, I love because the people behind them are not just talking heads. They've built businesses. You know, they've contributed in a positive way. You have these lot of negative people. I always give people advice that I like. Even my wife, she's like, "Oh, this guy trolled me," or like whatever. But she's so seasoned now. Anyway, she's been in the space for, I don't know, 7 years at this point. She's the real OG. But a lot of people, you know, will get discouraged very easily or get pissed off, but answer the trolls. I always say this. This is what you do. Whenever someone's trolling you, click their profile and see who they are. How many followers versus are they following, right? What have they done? Who are they? Do they have a public name? If all these questions you can't answer, then don't even try. Just forget it.
That's good advice. Let's think a little bit more about the question of talking heads for a minute, because one of the things that you founded is crypto.iq, right? Which
Mm,
I'd love for you to talk about more generally. But one of the things that I understand crypto IQ serves as is kind of information and news curation, right?
yeah.
And so, given what you were just saying, how there are so many pundits and talking heads out there, not to mention simply misinformation about crypto and Bitcoin, how do you go about curating that and figuring out how to separate the wheat from the chaff?
Oh, we launched IQ in 2017 as an internal community that people can pay to join. That we have staff. You know, Ronnie's sitting right here next to me. That we have staff, you know, in our offices in Florida, and then in the rest of the world, that are in these chat rooms, in the newsletters. We have multiple, you know, curated chat rooms that are different subjects and moderated, to handhold people who are like new to crypto but kind of want like a guy. You ever see the Wizard of Oz? Remember, like whenever she would like have like a problem that with the fairy godmother would show, like we want to be that. I've wanted to be that for people in crypto. Obviously, need to charge people for that, and so we've been doing it for 2 years, and it's great. We've been our members love it, under the radar, building the business, growing, and it's really those businesses that you don't hear a lot about that are the ones that are very successful. Look at your business; you guys have been around a very long time, but I don't see like, you know, you guys don't need to like have billboards out there because your users love you and you provide a great service and you've been doing it for a while. And those are the type of business that are like the best.
So basically, look for the places with a track record that speak for themselves when you're trying to separate the wheat from the chaff.
Yeah. The biggest metric you should always look for in crypto, is like time, length of time. I'll give you an example. Um, I just got an email today for someone who's interested in me joining as an LP in their next fund. I did all the research. I have to do a lot more due diligence, but I looked at the research and I was looking through it. And their first fund launched in 2014. And so this is like their fourth one. And they showed the metrics. One of their funds is down 90% because it was like, but that's okay because Bitcoin's down 90% or whatever it is. But I like how transparent they were. I like how, you know, the funds they're up and they're down, but they're all up. And I like how this fund, like, no one really knows about, but all the companies that they've invested in are companies that you and I know of, and they've just been around forever. And so the like length of time that you can continue to be successful in this space, that's a huge metric. That's a huge metric for me, at least.
It's a good one for people to keep their eyes on. I like that. Charlie, you wear so many hats that I'll confess one of the things I didn't even know until I looked more into you was that you were one of the founders of the Bitcoin Foundation and served as its vice chairman, which is awesome. But one of the things that I'd love to ask you about, given that, is just what's your perspective on the role of foundations for blockchains and crypto? Like, do you think that they're necessary for a blockchain to succeed? Do you think they're nice to have? What's your take there?
It's a lot of projects and tokens launched like foundations as legal structures. That's a question I don't really know how to answer because um, I sometimes I don't understand why they're creating these hodgepodge, very complicated situations. But that's neither here nor there. The foundation was conceptualized with a very specific goal in mind, and that goal was to bring the nascent fledgling Bitcoin community together in terms of resources. So the idea was basically like all the companies in the space would join. They'd contribute a few $1,000s each a year. That allows for a budget to be spent on that billboard. Or the reason I started so the foundation actually started with me and Gavin sitting in a cafe together in Austria. And the idea was I was sitting with Gavin. I was like 20 years old, and I was like, Gavin, I want to run a conference. And he's like, well, I want to get paid as a developer. And I said, well, why don't we start something where you can get paid as a developer and I can run a conference? And that's literally how the foundation was launched. The first thing we did was launch the first and best thing the foundation ever did was launch that first Bitcoin conference in 2013 in San Jose. After that, it all went downhill.
So it sounds like the advice is don't just launch a foundation for the sake of it, but have a specific purpose in mind.
They're foundations can very easily get power hungry. Like there's too much centralized power.
Which could then end up being antithetical to the purpose.
Yeah, exactly.
Of technologies.
But I can appreciate the need for industry associations, and I'm a big fan of them, like the Bitcoin Mining Association, the Florida Bitcoin Business Association, that I'm also a founder of here in Florida. So you have like whatever.
Sure. In a similar vein, when you think about crypto or Bitcoin overall, is there some kind of common myth or misconception that you'd like to just debunk or clarify for our audience?
What do you mean?
Well, do you think, when you look at either people who are totally outside the community and just know about Bitcoin nominally, or even like people who are inside the Bitcoin community, do you think that there's some thing that they all take to be true about the community that's not actually true that you want to clarify?
Good question.
So, as a toy example, right?
Yeah.
I think that like pure Bitcoin maximalists who think that only Bitcoin will survive and there's no value in other altcoins, some kind of myth like that. Is there any?
I mean, there is a select group of people that believe that, but it's very small. If you ever go to these like super Bitcoin maximalist conferences, there's only like a few hundred people there. So like, don't get blocked out by the noise. And don't fall for scams like Richard Hart's Hex and shit like that.
Sure. So sounds like the advice is don't be misled by vocal minorities.
Yeah.
Do you have any recommendations while we're on the topic of scams for people who are just getting immersed in Bitcoin or crypto about how to differentiate between scams and legitimate projects?
Well, obviously, any company or project that's offering any guaranteed returns or even talks about returns at all, you should completely avoid. Any coin or token that talks about returns, completely should avoid. Now, this is a funny one. If you see a company that's excited about offering 8% returns per year, and if they're excited about it and you're not, then that's legit. Because like those are like real returns. You know what I mean? Like these distributed finance companies offering like 8% on your those are not scams, and because that's very easily attainable and stuff like that.
Got it. That's good to know. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about China. So, back in kind of the OG Bitcoin days, China was a really big deal. There were companies like BTCC that were very prominent, right? Eventually, as Bitcoin grew, it became a little bit less dominant. But then, going into the end of last year with comments from their president about the value of blockchain and so on, there seems to be this renewed interest in China and Bitcoin. So do you have any perspective on what role China will or won't play in the future of Bitcoin?
China is going to play a huge role for the future of Bitcoin, as will India and all countries where they feel disenfranchised, but also they don't have like stable monetary policy. Places where the places that where cryptos are going to succeed the most, in my opinion, are places where the financial infrastructure is not very good. Someone said something to me yesterday. He's like, everyone's looking for like Bitcoin's killer app, but we've known what it is since day one. It's finance. So why are we trying to like, like do other things? We have the killer app already. And I'm kind of like in somewhat of agreement with that. Like, I'm not to say that there aren't other killer apps, but at the same time, like finance is definitely like distributed finance is an awesome, product that came out of the sector. And it's so fun. I think this is my opinion, but I think you talk about some of the good that came out of the bad. Some of the good that came out of the bad is I believe that the distributed finance industry came out of the ICO bubble, because here you had a need for people who have made all these gains, but also all these companies that need to hedge their money that they got and borrow against it. And so we talk about like what came out of the bad from the good. The distributed finance bubble came from the ICO.
That's interesting. I'd never thought about it that way.
Me neither until just now.
Right. There you go. As you look around crypto and Bitcoin right now, what's happening that excites you the most, whether that's a particular project or a particular movement, anything like that?
I like to see more products and services built on top of the industry. I'm very selective of the sponsors for Untold Stories. So if you go to untoldstories.com, you can see who my sponsors are, and I purposely choose, I purposely don't allow products and companies that are scams or that do tokens or whatever that I don't like. So you look at my sponsors, and they're all building some really cool. I just added a new one, a company called Crypto Tax Audit, and it's such an amazing, cool product. I mean, I don't mean to like plug him, but the concept of what he did was creating this model of basically he'll audit you, and if it's all good and nothing needs to be changed in your tax returns, in the future, if you ever get audited by the IRS, whatever costs or lawyers or involvement, they pay for everything. They do everything. You don't have to do anything. And if there are things that need to be fixed, they know how to do, fix your tax returns and do it in a way that allows you to have amnesty. So that's pretty cool too.
So, well, you mentioned Untold Stories. I'd love to dive into that a little bit more because it is a great podcast, and the concept of untold stories from the crypto space is so simple but so interesting. So, I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you started that, how you decided on the format, and what you think makes for an interesting story in the crypto space that's worth telling.
Oh my God. Give me an example.
um, I don't. So I mean, well, as long as we're doing plugs, right? Let's think about when you brought Danny onto Untold Stories, right? And talked about SFOX, right? Like when you bring on a guest or whatever, how do you decide on what stories are worth asking them about and exploring? Because there's just so much. I think what I'm getting at is there's just so much information out there about crypto and Bitcoin now, and everyone kind of has a story to tell, whether that's something scammy and uninteresting or something that really contributes value to the overall sector and gets people interested. So, as a podcast host who decides on bringing on guests and asking them certain questions, how do you try to bring out and elicit the best stories for your audience that they'll really care about?
The show is highly produced, and what I mean by that is from the moment that a guest is booked, which happens sometimes months out, like I'm already booking into April. From the moment a guest is booked, and I probably record, I think I'm in the studio 4 or 5 days a week, and I have a physical studio. I don't like record from home or anything. I go to an audio studio, and what happens is that the show starts to get researched, and so we research the guests, we research who they are, what about them, probably put together like 5 or 6 pages of content about each guest. And then I write the show. And what I mean by that is I go through all the research and I start to formulate subjects and thoughts and ideas and different topics that what I like to do is I always try to say, what does my guest know more than me about? How is my guest? Most of the time, it's easy to figure out, because all my guests are just brilliant people. And then I almost like to focus on those, because I like to say, if I'm learning something, then the listener is learning something too. So that's what I try to focus on. And so if you listen to the interview we did with SFOX, you'll see that I'm learning as I'm interviewing, and everyone likes learning from stories. So I'm learning from stories as I'm interviewing too. And it's really cool.
I think it's really cool too. And just to speak honestly, the work that you and your team puts into those really shows. So thank you for that. And
Thank you. And it really, really is a team. At the end of the show, I do credits and I talk, I name everyone specifically. It's like 10 people. How many people work on the show? Like 8 people. A lot of people work on the show. Between the audio engineers, the content writers, the producers, the sales people. I mean, everyone. So yes, 75% of the income from sales automatically goes towards like paying salaries of all the people.
That's awesome. As you look forward to 2020, which I can't believe we're already basically 1 month into it now, what do you think will be the defining story in crypto or Bitcoin for the year?
I think the defining story for crypto, I think we'll start to see now is like how, although we went through this bear market for the past 2 years, where is the industry? And I feel like if you look at every other metric besides for price, you'll see that we are healthier now than we were 2 years ago. And I think the lesson that now that we've, because that the bear market, not in terms of like price size, but in terms of people who were going through it, it's huge. I mean, look at you. How many people work for your company? How many companies are there? Multiply. It's a huge number that are your day in, day out. And so the lesson I think that's learned now is like bear markets are not bad. They're the time for building. They're the time for growing. And if you look at Satoshi, almost like tried to, at least, and so far it's been successful, to bake the bear markets into the industry with the halvings, and then, with the halvings coming up, there's still like that, not fear, but will the price go up at the halving? There's still that insecurity enough to like where it's not guaranteed. Because if it was guaranteed, then Bitcoin would be a scam.
So let's talk more about the halving, because everyone in crypto has their own pet theory about how it might affect the price or why it matters or why it doesn't. So what's your take on whether or not the halving matters and why?
So I'm trying to see this is probably my third halving. And what's probably funny is that as you haven't seen it yet, but like starting like 60 days out, there's like a fear that halving won't work. And what I mean by that is, you ever see those old movies like Indiana Jones, and he goes like an old Egypt like tomb and he pushes the stone and the door opens? It's like that stone hasn't been pushed in like 1,000 years. So there's like a section of the Bitcoin code that's only triggered like every 4 years. And there's like a fear that all the updates and changes that we've made, something will break. And it's kind of fun because it puts people on like on edge a little bit, but also like, I don't know, the speculation around the halving gets crazy, and the volatility. And if you're a trader, it's actually very fun to swing trade around that.
Yeah, I believe that. So let me ask you, so we've talked about Untold Stories and we've talked about Crypto IQ. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this, you are a man of many hats. Are there any other projects that you're working on right now that you want to talk about?
Honestly, besides for Untold Stories, Crypto IQ, I really am focusing on those 2 projects the most right now. I do some consulting, but honestly, it's within these two kind of like companies right now.
And given just how broad the space is and how many opportunities to work on there are, and how many things you've done in the past, how do you decide which opportunities are really worth it and you want to?
If there's any compliance involved, I'm out.
Okay, how's that for an honest answer?
Yeah, I'm not even going to become like a barber. I'm not going to cut hair because you need a license for that.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough.
But thank you for having me and for doing this. I appreciate it too.
Oh no, of course, man. My pleasure. We're happy to have you. I know you have to get going. Do you have time for a few more questions?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, perfect. What has you really curious right now about crypto and Bitcoin?
Um, I'm a geek when it comes to consensus algorithms. A lot of like the scientific things about Bitcoin and crypto, a lot of like the socioeconomic factors. I like I like to study humans in real time. So I like to see, I kind of like to geek out and see like really cool um, scenarios play out and that follow. I like to see human interactions and scenarios play out that kind of follow different theories that we know, but also interactions that don't follow the theories that we know. And so Bitcoin and crypto are like perfect examples of that because, um, you know, I think that Bitcoin is like the largest socioeconomic experiment the world has ever seen. And so like you're taking half of math, you're taking all these mathematical and economic theories, and then you're taking all this information that we don't know about like us as humans and how our brains kind of like talk to other humans and how we act and react, especially when it comes to like money and value and validation and things like that. So to see these things kind of like play out in real time, I know I go down the rabbit hole, is something that I love to follow and kind of excites me a little bit.
Yeah, it excites me too, for sure. Let me ask you then, as you think about kind of the future of crypto and Bitcoin, clearly, I mean, I think it's clear to you and I at least, it does continue to grow and more people are being brought into the fold all the time. But what, if anything, do you think needs to change in crypto and Bitcoin in order for real mass adoption to be achieved?
I honestly get this question a lot, and I don't really think anything needs to change. I think we're on a good course. I think we're on a good course. I think, if you were to if you were to be able to like tell me 7 or 8 years ago like where we'd be now and like what the industry looks like, I would never believe it. You know what I mean? So I think we're on a great course. I think we're doing all the right things. I think the people, the companies, how we deal with regulations, how we deal with governments, it's all like 75% good. It's all like, and that's good enough for me.
Fair enough. What's your favorite crypto book?
Obviously, the Bitcoin Billionaires by Ben Mesrick is my favorite Bitcoin book.
Yeah, that's fair. That's
It's
kind
a
of what
great
I'm
book.
putting on for an answer. It is a great
Yeah.
book. Um, if you could be any animal in the world, what would you be and why?
Oh, I've actually thought about this answer once before, and I don't remember what I said, but maybe I would want to be like an eagle or something, so I can just like fly and eat birds and stuff. I don't know. I haven't thought about it. I don't want to be an animal.
Okay, you're happy being a person.
Yeah,
Eagle is a good one though. I like that.
yeah.
I know there are lots of different ways to connect with you online, but for any of our listeners who do want to find ways to connect with you, what's the best place to get started?
Yeah, the best way to connect with me is to follow me on Twitter. I'm very accessible. If you go to untoldstories.com, my email is like right there. I try to read every email. I try to respond to it, even if I don't, like or agree with what you're saying. Sometimes it's not on day one, but I'm pretty good with that. I'm actually really good with that. So yeah, I mean, tell people to read. You'd be so surprised but the nuggets of information and stuff that I get from like an email where 90% of the email was like the stupidest thing I've ever read. But the other 10% was brilliant.
That seems to be a good encapsulation of what you were saying earlier about separating the wheat from the chaff in crypto too, right? Like there are those
Yeah,
nuggets of insight. You just have to know how to sift through everything to get to them.
exactly.
Well, I think that pretty much covers everything, Charlie. Thank you for being so efficient. I'm glad we were able to get to it all in the time that you had. So let me just again, from all of us at SFOX, thank you for taking the time to chat with us and for having Danny on Untold Stories. It's been so great getting a chance to get your perspective on everything crypto and Bitcoin.
Thank you. Thank you for having me and keep on what you guys are doing. You're celebrating what, your like 5-year anniversary soon, or what's the story?
Yeah, we started in 2014. So
And
going,
that's unbelievable. Congratulations.
thank you. Thank you. Well, not quite as long a tenure as you.
Any Bitcoin or crypto company that's celebrating a 5-year anniversary, like let me know. I want to like be a part of it.
Much appreciated. All right. Well, Charlie, thank you again so much. I'm sure our listeners and readers will get a kick out of this, and we'll hope to connect with you again in the future. Okay.
Thank you. See you guys later.
Thank you, Charlie. You have a good one. Bye.